Hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the Nintendo Game Boy, the original handheld console from 1989, not the later versions like the Game Boy Color or Advance. Now, the Game Boy was released in 1989 as Nintendo's entry into the handheld gaming market, and unsurprisingly, because Nintendo was at the top of the world, they pretty much dominated third parties by making them sign contracts and stuff. Look it up. This is what they did in the 90s. They basically had pretty much full control. So not only, they also had a guy called Gunpei here, whatever this guy's name is pronounced, I'm not sure, design it. So the system has a few things different from its competition. And of course, the Game Boy pretty much outsold competitors because of the way he designed the console. He designed it to be cheap to manufacture while getting long battery life, so the system was able to undercut the competitors and outsell it as well. So, should we take a look at the system? Let's take a look at it. The front of the system has an iconic design, maybe because it was made by Nintendo and because everything Nintendo sold well. It has a pretty iconic design. You got the screen up here, the D-pad up here, the buttons here, start select here, and the speaker. Despite saying dot matrix with stereo sound on the top, this system only has one speaker. To get stereo sound, you must connect a pair of headphones. While I know Nintendo sold officially branded headphones with the console, they also made it so they just put a normal headphone jack on here. So the system has pretty much the same layout as the Nintendo Entertainment System, AB. It's pretty obvious that they were even trying to take design cues from it as well, considering the color scheme of it. So let's take a look at the system. On the front, you've got this screen. The screen is terrible. It's not monochrome, it's more like some pea green, pretty much every color you don't like in one color. You could describe it as pea green, you could describe it as body waste, you could describe it as many nasty things, because it just looks flat out nasty. And it's only black and white as well, it's pretty much monochrome. And it's dot matrix because it's pretty much that. It can display shades of gray, but it cannot display colors at all, unlike the competition, the Lynx, and the Game Gear, which it outsold. On the side here, you have a volume knob and a link cable port. Now, what is this link cable port? Well, let me take it off and show you. Okay, so I've got the link cable port cover off, and as you can see, it looks just like a FireWire port. I mean, other than the connector shape being slightly different, if you've ever seen a FireWire cable from like an old Macintosh, it even looks similar. And in fact, I read somewhere that this cable design influenced that of FireWire. Another thing I thought I'd point out is that this Game Boy will not work with your old link cables from, say, Game Boy Pocket or a Game Boy Advance. You'll need to use a special universal link cable to connect your original Game Boy to, say, a Game Boy Pocket or a Game Boy printer or that kind of stuff. And let's go to the other side. On the other side, you have a DC port. This requires 6 volts instead of the 3 volts the later Game Boys do, and the contrast knob. Now, this system also has no backlight, unlike its competition. So, if you're in a dark room, it's harder to see. On the top, you have the power switch, which actually, as you'll see here, has something that comes in to prevent you from inserting or moving the game while the power's on. And that's also why Game Boy cartridges have the trademark notch. On the back here, you see DMG 001, that stuff. And this actually takes 4 AA batteries, unlike the later Game Boys. Now, while this system was able to get more battery life out of batteries from the 90s, it does, however, have a problem. You see, not only does this require more batteries, but the hardware itself is unreliable. Sure, there's that one Game Boy that survived Operation Desert Storm, but This Game Boy is pretty big, chunky, and it has reliability issues just like every other late 80s, early 90s handheld. I mean, let me get something up here. Okay, people know how the Sega Game Gear was big, but how big was it? Well, let's just put it next to this old, big, chunky Game Boy and see how big they are. As you can see, the Game Gear and the Game Boy are pretty much the same size. They're both big and chunky handhelds. The only difference is, the Game Boy only has its old monochrome pea green screen, while the Game Gear, on the other hand, color backlit screen. Of course, the batteries are low on this because I had nickel metal hydride, and you can even adjust the contrast, but as you can see, nice screen for its time. And it came like in the same era as the Game Boy too, but this is not a Game Gear review, this is a Game Boy review. So I'm going to talk about the Game Boy. Now, before I turn this on, I'm going to take one look at the game cartridges. The game cartridges for this thing come in cases. With the Game Boy, games came on these real distinct cartridges. Now, they have a notch in the corner because just like the Super Nintendo and other systems from the era, when you were playing the games, you weren't supposed to take them out. So basically, they put the notch there to keep you from taking them out. And Super Nintendo cartridges have a similar notch in the middle. Now, these are small, and they come with cases which are useful because they can protect your games from getting dusty. Now, to insert the game in the Game Boy, all you do is you insert the cartridge just like any other cartridge-based system. Put the game in. Push it in. And then you notice how unreliable the Game Boy is. You see, the Game Boy had a design flaw. Somewhere along the line, the LCD screens, for some reason, they somehow have dead lines. Now, this is a common problem with the Game Boy because apparently I went on Google and I searched Game Boy dead lines, and this was a common problem because many times there will be something with the screen that goes bad and you have to resolder it, and apparently, considering how many threads there are on the same issue, it seems to happen a lot. The system itself, well, it's nothing real special. Pretty much all it has is, it has a bunch of games on it, but, well, here's the thing though. The system is pretty underpowered. The system only is capable of displaying monochrome graphics, which are hard to film with the camera. I'm not even trying to play this game, but... And it's only capable of 8-bit sound. Well, the sound isn't the bad part. The screen, however, you can tell the system is kind of iffy when it comes to displaying stuff. I mean, look how hard it is to get the screen on camera. It has that real distinct pea green look, like I said. And it just looks flat to play on. I mean, unlike the later Game Boy Pocket, which went to a more standard monochrome screen, this has a kind of bleh screen. And of course, it's also kind of blurry. While it's far from the blurriest screen, it doesn't really have a good refresh rate. Now, the other thing I thought I mentioned with the system is about it. It also supports link cable support. Now, while many games just had basic 2-player modes, some games really made big use of it, such as the Pokemon franchise. And while the Game Boy wasn't that good of a system hardware-wise, there were later versions that improved on it. And it did have many notable games, such as the Pokemon franchise, and a few Nintendo first-party games, and that's about it. I mean, and a few spin-offs of some other games, but let's be honest. Other than Pokemon, the Game Boy, in my opinion, didn't have too many notable games. I mean, just look at how much more attention the Nintendo home consoles get over the Game Boy besides a few first-party games like Super Mario Land, Pokemon, and that stuff. I mean, sure, Pokemon Gold and Silver are fun, but the original Game Boy itself is kind of meh. It's not that great of a system. There's newer versions which are better, such as the Game Boy Pocket, in my opinion. And of course, there's the Game Boy Advance SP with the backlight, which can play the same games this will play. So what are my thoughts on this system? It just wasn't that great. Even for its time, there were better systems like the Game Gear and the Lynx, but the Game Boy outsold both of them because it was cheap. I mean, sure, neither of them got too many notable third-party games. I mean, sure, the Game Boy had the Pokemon franchise, but I mean, many Game Boy games were badly watered-down versions of console games. Maybe not from Nintendo, but from pretty much many developers. I mean, sure, there were some notable games on it, but other than that, let's be honest, that's what many Game Boy games were. I mean, it's not just with the Game Boy, it's the same with many portables. Only until, like, the PSP came out, were there portable games that could kind of rival the console versions. I mean, sure, even with the Game Gear, they were closer to the console games than the Game Boy was, because the Game Gear had color, the Game Boy, the blandest monochrome screen in the universe. And eventually, let's be honest, there's a reason the PSP eventually ate into Nintendo's market share because, well, Nintendo was pretty far behind with the DS. I mean, the DS didn't have too many good games either. Sure, it had a bunch of cult underrated games that got pretty popular, but other than that, the Game Boy line just isn't that great in my opinion. I mean, look how much shovelware you see when you're looking for Game Boy games. But anyways, thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.